Hello, I'm John Devitt. I'm pleased to be here with Chris Williamson, and today we're following up on our campaign with Tyne models, where we're talking about different aspects of life, mental health, and other issues on how people sort of realise who they are and where they've been. And Chris, can I just ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
So, hi, I'm Chris Williamson. I'm a model with Tyne. I have been for 11 years now. I'm a club promoter from Newcastle. I've done a little bit of reality TV stuff. I'm a company director for an events company, and I also do a podcast called Modern Wisdom.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being with us today and for coming to share your story. So, Chris, if we just roll back a little bit from you've got a big career there, you're doing an awful lot of things. We had a little chat beforehand. One of the things that most people might know you from is from Love Island.
Yep.
Right. So could you just, because you made some interesting points about how that affected you and, you know, what that show did for you, if that makes sense.
Interesting, yeah. So I think when a lot of people ask, what did you get out of the show or how was it being on there, what they're expecting to hear is, I got loads of social proofing, I got to have easy girls for the next couple of years, I got to have free bottles and stuff in nightclubs. Whereas for me, what happened was I was delivered a fatal dose of contrast between a group of people who were the person that I was acting out. So I was pretending to be this lad around town, promoter for 10 years, and I lived for 4 weeks undiluted with people who do live and breathe that. And what happened was it very quickly highlighted to me, hang on, that's not the person that you actually are. You thought it was, and having seen them 24/7, you were like, yeah, okay, that's definitely not what I am. That means that there's a problem. Problem requires solution, and the solution was I need to go on a bit of a journey of emotional intelligence learning and some self-discovery, a bit of introspective work, and come out the other side to try and actually work out who I was. I think, especially in the nightlife industry, there's a very typical mold that people expect you to be in, and the deeper that you grease that groove, the more successful that you can be.
Right.
People want archetypal roles. They want the hero, the maiden, the villain. They want to be able to put people into very particular kind of boxes. And one of the things for me, I think having a slightly more eclectic mix of interests leads people to not get you quite so easily. And what that means is they don't resonate with you straight away. And given the choice between honesty and acceptability, a lot of the time you'll choose the latter. Reason being that you don't want to say something that's alarming or contrary or subtle. Yeah. Because people don't get it.
So how was your mood when you're on there? Because you talked about having to wear lots of different masks all the time. And when you're wearing masks, you at some stage you lose sense of yourself, first of all, if you knew it in the first place. And so I suppose the starting point is before you went onto the show, did you consciously feel you were having to play a role, or was it subconscious at that stage to fit in, if that makes sense?
So I think with regards to the show, I had a pre-made idea of what they wanted from me and what I should do to be successful with regards to the show. Now, the show actually itself wasn't that big of a deal. It just ended up being the peak of this particular experience. It was the top of this particular story arc for me.
Got you.
And just the right amount of catalyst that was going to springboard me towards a life that was a little bit more virtuous after having done the introspective work. But beforehand, so I've suffered with depression for a long time. I think naturally I'm quite a depressive person. If you roll a choice down the top of a fence, I'm always going to fall off on the side of catastrophe, not on the side of success. Yeah, that's my presumption all the time. I think I work in an industry which is very changeable. Club nights, as anyone who's ever been out and been in the club scene for a while knows, it's very, very quickly paced, and it means that you don't end up with a lot of security because work was my life for a long time. I think that fed back into what would have probably already been some existing levels of anxiety and so on and so forth, as we all do. So the way that depression and anxiety manifested itself for me was that I would tend to stay in bed for a long time. So I would refuse to get out of bed, or I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed.
And is this while you were working the nighttime economy, or is this...
Yeah.
So if you weren't working, were you locking yourself away? Or...
Not all the time. This would come in periods.
Right,
so I'd have batches. I'd have batches of it. And one of the worst things is, one of the things that's really insidious about running your own company is that when you're the boss, there's no one to tell you not to do it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not accountable to anybody, and I can make up my own excuse. I'm ill today, I'm tired today, I'm whatever, or just not say anything. And like, who's gonna shout at me?
Yeah.
Like, there's no one above me, so it's all on me. And yeah, that meant that liberation was actually oddly worked against me there.
Right.
But yeah, so depression for me manifested itself in terms of me. I would stay in bed. I would get myself into negative thought loops.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time, when people don't have something very, very tacit that is the cause of their depression, when it's this kind of nebulous sense of dread, this drowning in thoughts that really don't have a reason or a purpose to them. I haven't been through some psychological catastrophe, not a major one. I haven't had any incredibly traumatic events, anything like that. And yet I was still suffering with depression, and that thought loop of the shame behind being defeated by essentially what I felt as nothing. Like, there's nothing catastrophic's happened, and I still am getting defeated by this, and I can't get out of bed.
Yeah.
There was a lot of shame associated with that. Yeah. And I thought, like, I shouldn't be like this, I should be able to deal with it, etc., etc., etc.
So, how old were you when you first became aware that you might be subject to low moods, depression, and these sort of conditions that you're just talking about now?
I think I always have. So I remember it at uni, so like late teens, 19, 20.
Right.
And, you know, badly enough, it took me until I was on Love Island at 27, and I still didn't really have the tools in my arsenal to be able to deal with it.
Right.
So, you know, I suffered with these batches of depression, depressive periods for a long time. And yeah, so the Love Island thing came about, and like I say, it wasn't about being on the show. It wasn't about the actual experience. It was just about the fact that it became a little mountain. It was like the zenith of everything that had come together before that.
Right, and it sounds like, correct me if wrong what you're saying, it was a catalyst as much for that point of change, though. So before moving on to discussing that, what those changes were and what helped you, in the period beforehand, what support or help were people around you aware of how you felt?
Not really.
Did you ever talk, or did you get ask for help at that stage?
No, I didn't. So I mean, that was, like I say, one of the problems was that I was associating being vulnerable, i.e. opening up, with being weak, which was wrong. As far as I'm concerned, showing your vulnerabilities is one of the strongest things that you can do. Yeah. And yeah, it meant that I was solely at the mercy of whatever experience I was going through. I'm an only child. Right. So I don't have close family like that. We don't have a broad family outside of that either. And the club promo world is inherently a very transactional set of relationships. Yeah. And if you're not being tremendously virtuous or connecting with, if you're not connecting with people that are on a similar level to yourself and have similar interests, etc., it can be really, really lonely at times, which sounds converse, right? When we're running a club night and I've got 2,000 people who all know my name that have just gone through the doors, and yet you can be stood on the front door and actually feel quite alone. Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, especially when people see, you know, for the people who do know what I do or who I am, you see the 80,000 followers on Instagram, you see the, you know, going away on holidays, running club nights. For a lot of people, that sounds like a dream life. And it was a lot less about the quantifiable metrics of success and a lot more about me not understanding my own mind. So did you enjoy it though? So I get a real sense of fulfillment from succeeding, from overcoming tasks and so on and so forth. My passion for partying itself has waned a little, but I still enjoy. We've just gone through Freshers Week, standing on the front door of a club club night you've worked up to for 2 months, and seeing queues out the door, and you know that there's still a buzz behind that, regardless of the fact that I'm drinking a water instead of a beer. Like, you know, there's still a lot of excitement behind that, and the job's always been fulfilling. Me and my business partner have started it, and we've been going for 10 years. It does fulfill me, but I don't think that the atmosphere of the industry overall is fantastic for mental health. I think that it's hyper masculine,
Right.
Especially for the guys. There's a mould that most club promoters are expected to fit.
Yeah.
And showing vulnerability, showing any real intellectual virtue, it's just not part and parcel of it. It's lads and birds and booze and, do you know what I mean? Like, it's that. It's not introspective work and have you read Carlo Ravelli's new book and did you see Jordan Peterson's most recent podcast?
Yeah.
So if those are your interests, we come back to given a choice between honesty and acceptability, you choose the latter.
So if you, and I think this is a really important point, because clearly, although you were in an industry that you're actually sort of enjoying, you know, you get validation from, you're getting connections with people, it's still quite transitory. So actually, you've got all those relationships around you. I suppose, where did you, before you made the changes that we're going to go on and talk to you about, where did you get that sort of, did you have those deeper relationships with any other source?
Not really, which I guess is quite sad to think of.
Right.
The fact that I had girlfriends and you know, we got on super well, but it was like, before I did the introspective work that allowed me to begin to uncover some of my biases and some of my beliefs and start to live with a lot more integrity and virtue and speak my truth forward and enact the logos, as Jordan Peterson would say. Before I did that, it was like I'd placed a glass ceiling on top, or a glass floor on the depth of connection that I could have with someone.
Right.
And that was because I wasn't prepared. Firstly, I don't think I actually knew who I was to a broad degree. I'd played the acceptability over honesty game so many times that I didn't even know what honesty for myself meant.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was, you know, I'm used to being on my own. I grew up on my own. Any only child who is listening will know the exact same feeling that it is. You're under-socialised. It is impossible for your parents to socialise you as an only child to the same level as someone that's got siblings. It does not matter how sociable your parents are. It is impossible. And I think that carried forward as I got later into life, that I thought, well, I've dealt with loneliness and anxiety and stuff like that before, because that was, to one degree or another, was a part of my upbringing. So fine, this is just the next step. Maybe this is just what life is. And then so that was that, I guess. Like the depth of connection, the depth of relationship was quite low. That's not to say that I didn't have good friendships, which I did. But again, I'd placed these barriers, I'd placed confines around how deep I was prepared to go and how deep I was able to go as well.
So when you go back, and if you think back to that period, because it's quite an interesting one, we hear this sort of these discussions around people having to play certain roles, put certain masks on. Not just, I'm not talking about the TV show, but actually through life when you come through.
100%.
Actually, when we're talking about recovery, the hardest bit isn't kicking drugs or dealing with anxiety or dealing with alcohol, for example. It's actually about looking at yourself for the first time. And quite often that's one of those sort of challenges. If you were to look at the circle of people you sort of knew previously, before you had those deep relationships, shall we say, how many people around you can you look back on and see also were wearing those sort of masks?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because everyone's good at playing the game. Yeah. It's difficult to work out who is wearing the mask, because a lot of people wear it incredibly effectively. Yeah. Like I say, you know, anyone who would have known me 3 years ago or 5 years ago, maybe if they had a really, really good sense of awareness, they would have gone, Chris is not quite 100% or whatever. But I think I played a pretty successful game at hiding my depressive periods, and that's not to say I was depressed all the time.
You know, how you dealt with depression at the time. At its worst, how did your depression sort of feel at that time? Are there any particular instances that sort of jump out to you?
No, unfortunately. So I didn't have a single traumatic event. It was just this pervasive, consistent, underlying low-level anxiety, big lack of gratitude, big lack of compassion, self-love. It wasn't, let's say, nothing catastrophic happened, but there was periods where it would be 3 or 4 days where I wouldn't get out of bed, broadly I'd maybe go to the shop and I'd see people and I'd make excuses. There was a couple of periods where it was sort of 3 or 4 days without leaving the house because I just couldn't bring myself to leave. I didn't want to see people. I didn't want to have to do things. And we were doing well. The business was successful. We were able to take over, and I was able to, in the same way that a drug or an alcohol addict can hide their substance abuse from people, I was able to hide my depression from people because I'd played this role of being big dick lad around town, you know, really cool, this sort of aspirational guy, remembering that we have 400 staff that work for us, and between myself and my business partner, we're supposed to be the 2 leaders of that company. We're supposed to be setting an example for people. Like, what sort of an example is it that your boss can't get himself out of bed for 4 days? So there was a lot of shame associated with that, and I think I felt a lot. I didn't really even know it at the time. I was just so ignorant. I didn't even know that I was at the mercy of something. I just thought that's what life was like.
Right.
And I think a lot of that was just due to not putting in the time. I wasn't learning about depression. Like, I'd never once typed into Google, what is depression? Yeah. Like, I'm pretty certain I've maybe had 1 or 2 anxiety attacks in my life. And I remember it happening, and I wanted to go and have a shower because I was shaking, and I thought, I'm shaking, I must be cold. But I had a shower in the warm shower and I didn't stop shaking. I was like, that's weird. And it was like 3 years later where I was like, oh, it's probably an anxiety attack. When I read about it, I'm like, how? It was so bizarre that it was staring me in the face that I was suffering with depression, but I'd hidden it so well. The shame associated with the outcomes, which were not getting out of bed and not wanting to speak to people, they were so... I was so worried about being rumbled for those that I hadn't even put the work in to work out what I was suffering with myself.
Got you. So, and I think it's a really interesting point, this, because actually what you've highlighted are very classic behaviours which are indicative of these sort of conditions. But actually, and you've said a few times that, well, you know, you hadn't put the work into understanding what it was. Would you have been capable of doing that at that time? Because a lot of this comes down to self-awareness in other people. And as you said, the shame of the behaviour of staying in bed. In a way, it's sort of been quite hard on yourself.
Very much so.
But that's because of the journey you come on. How much do you think stems? You said there was no sort of major trauma that stimulate these sort of things. What about self-esteem and where you're so on? How did you view yourself when you, right at the start of these, when you sort of put these masks on to fit in or to develop in that industry? Do you see where I'm coming from?
I understand.
Yeah.
I think I'm a lot deeper than I gave myself credit for. Right. And one of the problems of that was that my self-esteem nowadays is very, very heavily born of what I know. How understanding and compassionate and grateful I am for things, how I'm able to help other people with stuff that's really fulfilling to me, like the podcast, etc., etc. But because I had none of those things in my life at that time, I was living this very transactional relationship that was people on the door of a club, money in, money out, etc., etc. And although it was fun, and that was the life that a lot of other young people lead, you know, like the partying lifestyle, and I didn't fit that mold, and that wasn't what an enjoyable life meant to me. But because I didn't know anything else, that was the model I was following. So
there was an unconscious disconnect from actually your whole life, really, and what you were living and what you were doing.
Very much so.
So if we move on to how actually, we talked a little bit earlier about how Love Island became that sort of catalyst, that sort of, you talked about apex that it came into. What was the first thought process that you thought, hang on, there's more to me than this? How did that come about?
So I didn't have a particular eureka moment with that, and I think one of the things that kind of comes up from this story generally is that you mentioned just before, why or how long had it occurred for, and why would you have been able to get stuck in and do the work early on? And we all like to think that we can expedite our progress, right? We all want to think that we can get to this by reading a book summary or by listening to a podcast that cites quotes. But without context and without the right mindset to accept these sort of things, and without really, really working hard and spending what you'd call in the gym time and attention.
Yeah.
Without doing that, all of this is a waste. And the perfect example for this is anyone who's listening at home, think about the last time that you scrolled down your Instagram feed and you saw an inspirational quote that someone put up. Why did that inspirational quote not change your life? It's because there wasn't enough time and attention, you weren't in the right frame of mind, it didn't resonate with you, there was no context. So for me, weirdly enough, you're probably right that even if I'd had the tools at my disposal when I was 24, 25, I just wasn't, for some bizarre reason, I don't really know what it is, I wasn't ready to make that realization. And there's a level of maturity that I think that you need to get to. I'm confident I would have been able to probably hurry that along a little bit had I have started exposing myself to some more mindful content before then. But yeah, to sort of jump on that point, you're totally right. To talk about, was there a moment, or what can I remember around about that time that kind of started to propel me towards doing the introspective work? There wasn't anything in particular. There was a number of experiences on the show, stuff that wasn't aired, where I just remember being sat there and thinking, this really is not me. Right. Hearing one of the lads talk about the car, the AMG Mercedes Black Edition 63 6.3 litre, this car he was going to get, and then for me to find out the next day that he didn't have a driving licence. I was like, this is not my world at all. And that's one that sticks in my mind, that made me think, right, like you're not these people. And that is not for me to say that the guys who are there are in any way more or less valuable in terms of what they have to say. It's just that we weren't existing on the same plane.
No, it's different. And I think the real issue for them, that may not be a disconnect.
No, they were living, so this is what I say, they were living their truths, right? They lived their truths on there, and that's what made them good cast members, and that's what made me a bad cast member. Right. The reason that I wasn't tremendously successful on Love Island was because I wasn't speaking my truth forward. The reason I wasn't speaking my truth forward was because I was terrified of what would happen if I did. So, perfect example, I'm sat down on the first night, anyone who's seen season 1, episode 1, I'm sat down with Danielle, she's next to me in the bed, and she looks at this tree, and it's outside of the lines, it never made it on the edit, looks at this tree and mentions something about it, can't remember what it is, and I just like whipped off some quote about, it's because of the blah blah, the Coriolis effect of the earth, or whatever it might be. And she turned and said, that's really clever, like, can you say some more clever things? And I was like, fuck, like that's not what Chris in this situation is supposed to say. Right. So I'm like, right, I need to start playing the game again. I need to start dumbing myself down, or I need to begin this rhetoric which is more typical to what I think that people want from me. So that's a good example, I guess.
I think that this is really interesting, because what really jumps out from the conversations we've had and just previously is how destructive not being yourself and listening to the real you is. Even if we're all going through this life. It all takes different stages to actually discover, or actually realise you've got to discover who you are first. But actually, the impact of not doing it, can be disastrous.
It's very, very bad. So Jordan Peterson, anyone who's listening and knows my podcast, is my favourite thinker, and he talks about enacting the logos, which is speaking your truth forward. And for me, learning to be able to tell the truth was probably the most important thing that I could do. And that meant truth if I felt vulnerable, truth if I felt sad, truth if I was interested in something, truth if I had an opinion about what some of my friends were doing. And very quickly, the truth to me is kind of like a superpower, right? Because it insulates you from ever being wrong. It insulates you from ever being uncompassionate, because all that you're doing is speaking forward what's inside of you. But it's quite difficult for people to tell the truth. It sounds bizarre, because it's one thing that everyone's always got at their disposal all the time, supposedly. You actually don't. A lot of the time when you look inside and you don't really know what you think, you don't have the truth inside. So how much do you think is that because for all those things that we touched on around things like fear of either upsetting people or of rejection, and then you're straight back into that's the core of self-esteem. Well, that's really what we're talking about. Just coming back to practical times, because it's some people who might be listening or who are struggling themselves with depression or anxiety or some of the issues, even just not knowing who they are, but they realise not who they are. What were the practical steps that you took? What were the first things that you did? How did you get on this path of self-discovery? So I recently I had to write the About Me for the podcast that I do, and as a part of that I tried to distill down what I'd done over the last few years, because there was a point that I was at which a lot of people may be at, and there's a point that I'm at now which is better. Now, I'm in no way self-actualized. I'm not, I still suffer with depressive episodes. And I don't really know where I'm going, but I've got a good idea of the path that I took to get here. And I understand the tools that I used. I think the first thing that, the first time that I really, really started to re-look at depression was when I read Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections. Right. And in that, he talks about how depression currently is being diagnosed as an imbalance of chemicals in the brain. Yeah. And a lot of people will believe that that's the cause of depression or that that's their reason for depression. And one of the problems with that, apart from the fact that it's wrong based on what a lot of the research says, another problem is that it makes you feel very helpless about that. Like, what are you supposed to do? If you've got this imbalance of, it's the same as being diabetic. Do you know what I mean? Like, stop being diabetic. Allow yourself to process glucose. You're like, well, I can't. In exactly the same way as that's the situation it puts you in. Yeah. What I realised very quickly was that I wasn't fulfilling any of the foundational principles that I needed to at least make myself prepare to be happy. Forget the self-esteem and the introspective work and all of that sort of stuff. Forget all of the more kind of ephemeral, nebulous stuff and just focus on the fundamentals. A consistent sleeping and waking pattern. I was a club promoter, so for a long time I had a very chaotic one. I still do, but I'm able to mitigate it now because I've got a plan in place. Right. 7 to 8 hours sleep a night. If you have under 6.5 hours sleep for 5 days in a row, you begin to start showing the same effect as someone that's pre-diabetic. Yeah. That's not good. No. Sleep and wake. Nutrition. Around about the times when I was going to be doing a lot of partying or a lot of work, I'd get up, have a bowl of cereal at 1 p.m, have a Domino's at 6 p.m, and then go back on the lash. That's not fantastic. Your brain and your body is built purely from the things that you put in your mouth. Like, what's my body made out of? It's made out of Budweisers and Domino's. Like, that's not a very good environment to exist in. So I got my sleep right. I got my nutrition right. I've always exercised, but it wasn't consistent. Right. I changed to do CrossFit, which meant that I was spending a lot more time outside, a lot more fresh air, big open spaces. It's a lot more social. In terms of connections, I had friends at the time, and I then doubled down on the ones who I was able to talk with most about the things that were most meaningful to me. Right. I started up a podcast with the guys who that really resonated with, and I got to spend a lot more time with them. So for me, focusing on the fundamentals, get your sleep right, get your nutrition right, make sure that you're exercising consistently. Yeah. Have a job that at least makes you feel remotely fulfilled, where you've got the level of creativity that you desire within your life, a little bit of independence. Start to build some relationships with people that think like you and that you can be honest and truthful with and actually genuinely care about you. One of Jordan Peterson's rules for life is be friends with people who want the best for you. Yeah, absolutely. And then after I'd got those things right, the trickle-down effect of that was that I was able to have something like compassion for myself. Yeah. Self-compassion was then able to come in because I was able to think, well, okay, like I'm the clarity of my thoughts is at least remotely okay because I'm not built out of Budweiser and Domino's on 3 hours sleep. Yeah. So yeah, after that came learning. Yeah.
But obviously they're your platforms from which you then built, which enabled you to start looking at actually the wider you, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, one of the things when we're working with recovery, we look at things you do: exercise, sleep, sex is really important to understand your sexuality and actually to have a positive appreciation for that, slightly differently maybe to what you might have had before when you were the big club promoter, etc. You know, we won't go into that, but have you changed has that been a feature of how you view things as well, or has that changed?
How so?
In terms of your pattern of your sex life or how that works, is it less
transactional?
Yes. And because obviously this is one of the big disconnects, is where you have a transactional relationship with people, be it either personal, physical or whatever, actually it changes how it impacts on you as well.
I understand. I think for me, thankfully, sex was one of those areas that didn't ever suffer in terms of I was never self-reflective about it or kind of self-abusive about the way that I was using sex or that I was being used for sex, or however you want to put it across. That wasn't ever a real concern for me. But certainly now I view any relationship with it's a lot more sacred to me. Right. Again, to go back to Jordan Peterson, be attractive to many women but choose one. Yeah. I think it is emotionally a more healthy way to be as a man. Yeah. And I think there's very few men for whom that's actually not true. Yeah. And I think that they'd be very surprised to hear it, because they believe that the zenith of success as a man is be attractive to many women and sleep with even more.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas actually, and this is really at the core, because it's about getting in touch with the emotional side of you, and to see how the impact it has, not just for that short period, but actually these sort of relationships are more than that. Mm-hmm. And actually quite often where you see people, and you see it with things like sex addiction, porn addiction, things like this, really in all of these issues, actually the issues becomes the disconnect from who you are that actually causes the problem.
Well, I think if you're on a night out and you, like, no one knows what the right number of dates is to have before you sleep with someone, but it's probably not one. Like, as a rule of thumb, it's probably not one. And the reason it's not one is because if it's one, you're low-hanging fruit. By definition, you are low-hanging fruit. Like, is that what you really want to think of yourself as a sexual partner, that you're low-hanging fucking fruit? Yeah. Like, so, I think with regards to the sex thing, I treat relationships a lot more sacred now. Even for the girls that I'm around and I don't have a sexual relationship with, I'm just generally a lot more compassionate to them. And that to me is more fulfilling than a lot of all of the one-night stands. Yeah. You know, that to me, it's easy come, easy go, right?
Another vehicle which sometimes people... quite often people hurt themselves with is alcohol. Now, we were talking earlier on that you've done a number of situations where you go dry for certain periods and stuff like that. How's that helped you, do you think?
So I've done 6 months sobriety twice now. And that was... the first one was about 18 months ago, and that was when I really, really wanted to double down on my personal progression. There's a blog called The Illuminated Man, and if you search that, there's something called monk mode, which they talk about focusing on the 3 I's, which are introspective work, isolation, and can't remember what the third one is. Anyway, the point is that you isolate yourself for a significant period of time from the things that you know that are bad for you. And for me, alcohol knocked me off. So I'm naturally a depressive person. For anyone who's listening, if you have depressive tendencies and your hangovers are worse than the night out, you're netting a negative, give up alcohol. And it just sounds so paradigm shifting that people go, oh, well, no, because I go out on a night out because that's what everyone else does. It's like, right, yes, that's fine, but you don't have to. No. Like, you do not need to go on a night out and wake up the next day and hate yourself, because that's what's going to happen. If you continue to do the same thing with a bad result, you know what's going to happen the next time that you go out and you get leathered. It's not going to change. The way you feel the next day is not going to change. So for me, I decided to do sobriety. It meant that I doubled down on being productive, and for 2 periods of 6 months, I did it. Then recently came back, had a couple of nights out in Newcastle. None of them were traumatic or tremendously bad, but very quickly I just thought, like, this isn't for me anymore. I didn't enjoy the night out anywhere near enough to suffer the consequences the next day. And the thing that's really insidious about alcohol is that you get diminishing margins of return of enjoyment over time. Absolutely. But you get an exponential increase in suffering. Yeah. And as soon as those 2 lines cross each other, all that you're doing is making yourself hurt for no more enjoyment. Absolutely. And I mean, again, this is, people have to make their own choices. Quite often what we see is what the relationship is with the vehicle that we're talking about. We talk about higher and lesser vehicles, for example, be it sex, be it alcohol, be it relationships which are unhealthy, etc. With alcohol, you've also got with it being a chemical, you've got a naturally depressing, it's a depressant.
So it's going to reinforce anything, and it actually really cuts across if people are on things like antidepressants, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting. So where next for you, Chris? What do you think? Where's your path heading now?
I'm not too sure where my path's heading now. I get maybe a message every couple of days from people who listen to the podcast that say that it's really changed them and it's helped. Right. And that, I've never had someone come out of a club night and come up to me and say, man, do you know what it is? Like, I was feeling alone, or I was on the brink of destruction, or I was this, that and the other, but when I heard those banging tunes and those 1 pound Jaeger bombs in there, it just changed me. And you're like, that's never happened. That never happened to me, right? No. And I didn't know how hungry I was for helping people until it occurred. And again, it all comes back to this transactional relationship. It's very, very short-lived, etc., etc. Yeah. Moving forward, I want to continue to help people understand how I got from where I was to where I am now. Right. In a sentence, that's it. I did a lot of introspective work, and an analogy that I use is introspective work is a lot like turning over dirty stones. For every one that you turn over that's clean, there's 20 that are disgusting and have something terrifying underneath. And you need to be incredibly brave to be able to do that. Like, it isn't easy to... It's not easy to ask yourself questions that you really don't even want to know the answer of. So for me, spending a lot of time with mindful content, further learning about myself, further learning about evolutionary psychology, learning about cognitive biases, and spending time around people who hold me to a high standard. So some of the rules for life that I try and stick to, I've got 40 that are on my wall. Number 1 is tell the truth. Number 2 is do not do the things that you hate. Number 3 is act so that you can tell the truth by how you act. Those first 3 rules, if you can get those first 3 done, you're on a really good path to actually living a life that is pretty fulfilling. I think to summarize, for anyone who's listening, find me on Instagram, give me a message, I'd love to help you. But focus on telling the truth. Yeah. Focus on living a life as close to virtue as you can find. Work out what your principles are. So principles are things that you will not compromise on, no matter what the situation is, and derive from that your virtues in life, right? Every time that you compromise on your principles, your brain's keeping a counter. Like a doorman stood on the door of one of my club nights, he's keeping a counter. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's really... That for me was the first part of losing self-respect, was the fact that I wasn't even prepared to be myself. And then I'd done it for so long I didn't know who I was. So tell the truth. Find some people that you know that are good for you. Rule number 6, be friends with people who want the best for you. Yeah. People who want the best for you don't tell you what you want to hear, they tell you what they need to hear. Yeah. So it's not giving you comforting words, it's not feeding you sugary sweets, it's telling you what you need to hear. So if you're around friends that keep on just being yes men to you or never question you when you do something wrong, they're not really friends. No. They're just people that are yes men. Get your sleep and wake cycle sorted. Sort your nutrition out. Get some relationships that are meaningful. Clean your room. Tidy up your room. A domain of competence that you're going to be able to live within. And then listen to Johan Hari on Joe Rogan. Podcast is unbelievable about depression. Listen to Matthew Walker on Joe Rogan. It's about sleep. Listen to any of the things with Jordan Peterson on there. Listen to any of the things with Sam Harris on there. If you manage to spend 50 hours of time and attention listening to those podcasts, you will begin to understand what the path is that you need to take for yourself.
No, that's great, Chris. And just to add something else you mentioned earlier, in terms of the medical model, that sort of chemical model that somehow depression is an imbalance, etc. Unfortunately, that's the mindset that has shaped treatment services. And actually, if you look at the level of antidepressants, which have gone up in some areas by 300% in the past 10 years, this is what actually you're seeing is the impact of that mindset. So if you had one message to sort of say in terms of to anybody who's listening to this, who actually don't know what those questions are, would it be to talk to family, friends? Would it be to listen to these podcasts, or a combination of those? What would you suggest to somebody?
As a final message, I'd say that you need to... Let me think. As a final message, I think that you need to first off, find some people who you genuinely can connect with.
Right.
It's difficult for people. If you're a rugby lad who happens to have a little bit of a deep side to them and you're around other rugby lads, it's going to be tough. But we're all connected by the internet.
Yeah.
Like, go on Reddit, work out what it is that you enjoy and go on Reddit, and there will be a community of people in there who will think like you.
Right.
For me, I made the majority of my transformation introspectively or in terms of emotional intelligence through crushing amounts of appropriate content.
Right.
So I listened, I watched, I read a ridiculous amount, and I could have done it. I'm sure there would have been a much more logical way to have followed it through, and I'm sure anyone who's listening will be able to find a much more expedited way of doing it.
Yeah.
But sheer time and attention of just listening to things that you care about, listening to things that help you understand yourself, because there's more connections in a single square centimetre of human brain tissue than there are stars in our galaxy. Our inner universe is so complex, and people just presume it doesn't come with an instruction manual. Like, it doesn't at all. And I don't know the cheat codes to it either. Like, It's not like someone's got unlimited happiness cheat codes sat in the back pocket. It's that they have got some habits, some principles that they stick to on a daily basis that they know that are good for them. So I think plan some goals is a good way to do it. We're teleological beings. Telos, it means target.
Yeah.
Teleological beings. So make yourself some plans. What do you want to be? Do you want to be happy? Okay, so you want to feel fulfilled in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time. How are you going to instantiate that on a daily basis? I'm going to get up at the same time. I'm going to eat well. I'm going to be grateful. Another thing that I would suggest using to anyone is journaling, like gratitude journaling. But yeah, I think as a parting note, everything that you've got about your own, or the vast majority that you have, as a parting note, anything that you're suffering with is within your control to change. You may need some help from some friends, you may need some help from a doctor, but changing your environment and changing the basics will make so much of a difference, so much more than relying on medication. The male fear of admitting to medical problems is so pervasive that I never ever once considered even thinking about taking antidepressants, because that would have been even more shame. And I mean, that's even worse. Like, to think that I wouldn't take a medication or even ask for it to try and help me. It shows how insidious depression can be.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, anyone who needs to speak, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, email me or message me. I'll always reply.
That's great. Chris, thanks very much. Been a real pleasure.
Cheers, mate.
And good luck keeping the black dog on the lead. So there you are. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.